In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing you my Howling Starfist build. This is a level 150 fists build that uses Bleeding and Beast Roar to great effect. So first up, let's talk about the fist weapon in general. This is something people have been asking me to do, and I've been hesitant to make a fist build just because the reach of fist weapons in general is very short, and a lot of times you miss enemies even though you think you're going to strike them when you would be able to hit them with just about any other weapon in the game. So I've been kind of hesitant to do a build with fists, but I found a good balance, I think, in this build, and I want to show you how to make it work to fill in the gaps of the weaknesses of fists, in my opinion. So essentially what I've done here is I've tacked on Beast Roar as my Ash of War to the Starfist, and the reason for that is, again, the weakest element of fists is range. They have very poor range, and you have to be right up against an enemy in order to strike them most of the time. And so by having Beast Roar, we have a very good ranged option. Not only can this thing hit from very far away, but it has very, very good tracking. It has very, very good speed for projectile, which allows it to, be used extremely versatilely in just about any situation, which kind of shores up the weakness of fists. If you are having trouble with playing with fists, I highly recommend adding an Ash of War that gives you some sort of range, or maybe using a bow or something that scales with dexterity or strength in order to give yourself a ranged option when you need it. The reason that I chose the Starfist specifically for this build is because it has bleeding intrinsically on it, which allows us to use Bloodflame Blade to add even more bleeding, which is great. And it has a really good R2. I like the R2 of this weapon compared to some of the other fist weapons R2s that kind of do like a 1-2 punch. This one actually kind of raises your fist up and smacks with both fists at the same time, and it kind of hits with both, creating a very, very powerful R2 attack that not only deals incredible damage, but also does 2 hits of bleed buildup compared to 1 in some cases. When I was trying out different fists for this build, and I'm putting the Ash of War Keen on it, you really don't get too much better scaling with other fists. Like, as far as I can tell, every fist has about B scaling and dexterity when you're going Keen, so there wasn't really, too much of a reason to go with anything else, and getting that bleed is really good. And the reason we want Keen for this build is that Beast Roar is a dexterity scaling Ash of War, meaning that it's going to scale off max level of the weapon as well as your dexterity scaling. So having the Keen setup is going to give you the most bang for your buck with Beast Roar damage. As far as talismans for this build, I'm using the Frenzied Flame Talisman. I don't have it upgraded, but you could upgrade it in order to increase the fire damage that you deal with this build. You're not going to get a ton out of it because you don't have any points in Faith. You will get some, a few more points of fire damage if you want, but you really don't need to upgrade this. And another reason I like using this one, although you could use another one for the same reason, is that it weighs nothing, so it adds nothing to your equip load. And then, of course, we also have the Highland Axe there, which increases your roar damage. We're using Beast Roar, so this is going to increase the damage of that by about 7.5% or so when we're using it. And again, what's really great about fists is because they're paired, whatever you have in that left-hand slot still gives its passive benefit to you, even though it's not equipped. So you can still be dual-wielding fists while you have that axe in your left hand, gaining that bonus. When it comes to armor, I have the White Mask. This is because you do set bleeding fairly often with this build. It doesn't happen all the time, but this is going to give you 10% attack power when you do that. Beyond that, what you really want to look for is armor with high poise, and the reason for that is you want to be able to get your attacks off through hits. You're going to trade blows. Anytime you have short-range weapons or you're dual-wielding, you want to be able to trade blows in order to finish off combos, in order to proc bleeding if you have a bleed setup, or to even stagger an enemy. We use a lot of charged R2s with this build, so you can stagger enemies quite easily as well. When it comes to talismans for this build, I use quite a few different ones depending on the scenario, but the two that I'm kind of always using are Shard of Alexander and Roar Medallion. The reason for that is those both will increase the damage of Beast Roar, and you're going to be using this all the time with this build. Beyond that, ones I like to use with this build are Lords of Blood Exaltation. This happens to work really well when enemies are weak to bleeding, or you're going to be using Bloodflame Blade a lot, and you're going to set bleeding on a boss a couple times. This will increase your attack power by 20%, which is great. Another good one for this build is the Rotten Wing Sword Insignia. If you know you're going to be doing a lot of attacking with your fists, sometimes depending on the scenario, you're using your roar more than your fists. It just depends on what part of the game you're on. For instance, if you're fighting like a bunch of flying enemies, they're just going to be really hard to hit with fists, so you're going to use your roar to take them down. This isn't the greatest one to use in that scenario, but swapping it for something else like Ritual Sword Talisman might be good in that case, because you're going to add 10% to your roar damage when you're at full health, and you're not really going to get much out of the Rotten Wing Sword Insignia. Another really good talisman for this build is the Axe Talisman. This increases your charged R2 damage. Charged R2s are very, very effective with this build because they hit with both weapons in the same strike. you're going to get very, very good damage, and you're going to get double hit on that bleed buildup, which is really good, and you're going to get that stagger damage. So I like doing a lot of charged R2s with this build, so you can sub this in when you know you're going to go for staggers. And lastly, Arrow's Reach Talisman does work with Beast Roar. It does increase the range that it can travel. And it also will increase its damage if it's like really far away, because the damage will start to drop off the further away you get. So this will increase the damage it deals at very long ranges and allow it to go further. So if you're planning on playing kind of like a sniper build with this, or if you're going to lean into that Beast Roar, this is also not a bad choice. When it comes to spells, all I really use for this build is Blood Flame Blade, and that's to add bleeding to your attacks a bit more to, like, you know, give you even better bleed buildup. You do have bleed natively on your weapons, but buffing with this will allow the bleed to build up a little bit more after each attack. And it will also provide Beast Roar with this effect, meaning that, like, if you hit an enemy a couple times, but then they back away and you hit them with a Beast Roar, their blood, you know, their buildup for their bleeding is still going to continue to build up, and then maybe you run in and hit them a couple more times and trigger hemorrhage. So this is really good. And you can even trigger hemorrhage with, you know, roars if an enemy backs away and you keep spamming Beast Roar. I've seen it happen many, many times. So there's good synergy here with that. So generally what you're doing on the landscape is just, you know, picking off enemies with Beast Roar as necessary, or softening them up and then finishing with your fists. Really, how you want to play is up to you. I like to use a lot of charged R2s on regular enemies as well, if I can predict their moveset, or if they're like enemies that are very easy to predict. This will get you a lot of staggers that you can get a lot of critical strikes with. When it comes to boss fights, it's going to vary depending on what the boss is doing. A lot of boss fights, you know, they're aggressive and you can get off a lot of fist attacks and you can trade blows because of your high poise. And sometimes bosses like to play back and you can hit them with Howling Roar. Or sometimes you have a combination of both of these, like Malekith's a great example. When you're doing that fight, sometimes he's really aggressive and sometimes he jumps away from you. So knowing when to attack with your fists versus your Howling Roar can go a long way. Just remember to keep buffing with Blood Flame Blade and keep this up, because again, it does apply to your Beast Roar. So this will help you keep that bleed build up on an enemy even when they move outside of melee range. When it comes to stats for this build, I have 50 Vigor, 25 Mind, 29 Endurance, 12 Strength, 80 Dexterity, 9 Intelligence, 14 Faith, and 10 Arcane, not 9, because of Blood Flame Blade, in order to meet the requirements of that. So 50 Vigor is pretty self-explanatory. You're a melee build, you're going to be trading blows, you need to live. So that's why we have that. And 25 Mind allows you to get off a lot of Beast Roars and allows you to keep buffing your weapon regularly. This is probably much more than you need, but it gives you a huge pool to play around with. Endurance is there, allowing you to medium roll with this build and still wear very heavy armor that gives you good protection and poise. Because you're using fists, which are very light weapons, you can get away with lower endurance with this build. But having a good endurance pool is still really good for stamina, in order to be able to attack and spam Howling Roar, or the Beast Roar ability, I mean. So it's not bad to have more stamina. You could even trade some more Mind for endurance in order to get some more stamina here, but it's kind of up to you. We have 12 Strength for this build, which you really don't need, and we have 80 Dexterity there because, as I mentioned, the Beast Roar ability scales off your Dexterity scaling. So having high Dexterity is going to increase the damage of that ability, which is going to be then much more effective, and it'll also increase the damage of your natural attacks because you're going to be on keen scaling on the Starfist. And you don't need any intelligence or faith for this build. I'm playing a Confessor, so if you're playing a different class, you'll probably have less faith, which will probably make this build even better. Just a final tip for this build, if you're going into a boss fight or a difficult fight and you're using the Flask of Wondrous Physique, I recommend using the Green Burst Crystal tier in order to give yourself more stamina recovery, because you're spamming the Roar and because dual-wield attacks take up a lot of stamina. You're going to be using this quite often. So, you know, you're going to go through your stamina. You're going to want to get it back really quickly. And then using the one that increases your poise damage is really good. This will allow you to poise break bosses much more effectively. Keep in mind that Beast Roar, although it doesn't do a ton of poise damage, does some, and you can actually poise break enemies and bosses with enough hits of melee and spam to this pretty regularly. Stay tuned. I think we have a couple more 150 level builds this week before we jump into some other builds.